Good. So welcome to this session on looking at the safety implications of encounters with dangerous people. First of all, let me thank you all for coming. It's a Saturday morning. I know that 9:30 isn't terribly early for a school day or a normal office day, but it is pretty early if you've been out drinking last night and socializing, as of course you should at least be networking here. My name is Gavin Rees. I'm the director of Dart Centre Europe, which is part of the Dart Centre for Journalism and Trauma, which is a project of Columbia Graduate Journalism School in New York. And what we do as an organisation is try and open up and facilitate discussions about how we as journalists and filmmakers cover the most challenging experiences people can face. So we're thinking of experiences that involve violence and trauma. What does it take for us to both look after ourselves and maintain our resilience, but also what does it take to have challenging conversations with people who've been affected by violence? And normally when we think about having challenging conversations with people who've been involved in violent situations, the normal focus of the discussion is what does it take to report sensitively and accurately on victims and survivors of violence. Today we're going to open that conversation into an equally important area, but an area that actually doesn't get very much attention, which is what does it take to talk to perpetrators of violence? And of course, perpetrators of violence may themselves have been victims of traumatic and disempowering experiences of different kinds. But there are particular issues in working with people that we need to explore and that don't get very much attention. So I'm delighted to be joined on this panel by two journalists, if I can use the word veterans, because you were just talking about the old age, who have a very solid density of working over many years on stories that involve perpetrators and criminals of different kinds. So first of all, on my right, I'd like to introduce Drew Sullivan, who is founder and editor of the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Programme. He's very well known to every investigative journalist in the world who works on these issues, and also very well known to a large number of high-profile international organised crime figures. Drew's won lots and lots of awards for his reporting. His reporting has helped bring down a Bosnian Prime Minister. You'll have heard of the Panama Papers, a project that he was deeply involved in. So essentially, he's been kind of everywhere when it comes to reporting on organised crime. Drew's also a former NASA payload engineer, is that correct? Or right. Rocket scientist. So if anywhere during his presentation he says this isn't rocket science, he's actually uniquely qualified to understand the difference between rocket science and not rocket science. Drew's also been a great mentor and supporter of lots of journalists, both at his organisation and other organisations, in trying to think through safety issues and to try and give us, no guarantees, but to try and give us a solid platform for looking after ourselves. And on my left, I have Susan, who's a journalist from Derry in Northern Ireland. She's a freelance writer and reporter with many national awards, a much garlanded writer who writes for the Irish Times, the Guardian, the London Review of Books, and other publications. She's also very well known for her books. She's written a number of very important books that look into detail at the impact of violence. Bear in Mind These Dead, Northern Protestants, and Unsettled People. So looking at the impact of sectarianism and community violence in Ireland and Northern Ireland, and also, as she was describing yesterday on another panel, looking beyond the stereotype that suggests that the only violence in Northern Ireland is the violence, i.e. the Troubles, and looking at domestic violence, rape, child abuse, and these issues that have until quite recently been very much under the radar. So I'm delighted to have her joining us on this project. I'm going to say a few quick kind of framing things before giving the floor to my two co-panelists. And I'm going to act as a sweeper, and at the end of their contributions, pick up a little bit on some of the issues to do with trauma and how we might think about that when we're approaching violent people. But the thing about conversations is they're quite hard to access. It's quite hard to access what goes on between a journalist and a source. So if you think about it, in our work, we spend a lot of time reading other people's product. So we read the interview, we read the report, but it doesn't really give you an indication as to what the conversation was like between two people sitting in chairs or meeting somewhere, and what were the dynamics of that. And so one of the questions is how on earth do we know what other journalists are doing when they're talking to violent people? And we might feel inspired to look for role models, and where are those role models? So if you watch TV news interviews, people interviewing politicians, or you watch films, are those a reliable basis for understanding the dynamics of a conversation with somebody who could be intimidating, threatening, or potentially dangerous in different ways? So, Susan, can you take us a little bit behind the curtain and tell us what you've learned working on these stories over the years?
Okay, is my mic on? Yeah. So, veterans, eh? So the first lesson of today is never confide your age in a man. There's been new lessons every day here, but that's probably my best one yet. I think that the risk of physical harm when you're working as a journalist is very like the risk of libel in some ways. Sometimes it's obvious where it might come from, but it sometimes comes from very unexpected sources. You know, you can be taken by surprise by something which turns out to be risky in a libel, in a defamatory sense, in the same way that you can be wrong about the kind of person who is safe. I was privileged to be on a panel with Gina Moore yesterday, and she was talking about trusting your instincts. My own instincts have very often let me down, so I don't think that they're always all that reliable. And I think it's risky to think that just because you feel safe, you are safe. There are, of course, circumstances in which it is very obvious that you're unsafe and that you should take some sort of note of how to deal with the situation. A friend of mine is a comedian in Ireland called Kevin McAleer, and he talks a lot about his grandmother. And he tells this joke about how his granny used to like to tell people's fortunes, and she was full of old sayings. And he said, my granny always used to say, if a man in a black balaclava carrying a gun comes to your back door, there's going to be a death in the family. And that, by the way, is an example of the black humour for which Belfast is famous. And we like to think that it's funny, but it's actually, of course, quite intimidating and outrageous. But that sort of circumstance is obviously an extreme example. If you're talking to people who are carriers of guns or known to be involved in armies, whether legal or illegal, you may be sure that that person is somebody you need to deal with caution. I think that Drew will probably be talking in a more practical way about the actual ways in which you can protect yourself in these situations. So I'll probably focus more on the kind of situations that you can find yourself in with these people. I'm not a war journalist. I don't see myself as a war journalist. I've never worn a flak jacket or a hard hat. I've never gone into a foreign military field. I've never been embedded. The conflict that I would have covered is a local one to me, and that carries its own risks, I think. It's safer in a way because you can read the signals, but it's also more dangerous because you are very passionately involved in the community which is at war. And in my case, I was passionately at odds with the point of view of my own people, so I found myself quite often really angry at people claiming to represent my people. So among the people that I have met who I would say are potentially dangerous would be angry, bereaved people, people who have themselves lost loved ones or lost comrades in armed struggles and so on. They I don't know what it's like in other countries, but journalists are deeply distrusted in Ireland, and in Northern Ireland in particular, where paranoia is ingested with mother's milk. People get very, very defensive with journalists very, very quickly. Paramilitaries are obviously dangerous. Former paramilitaries turned gangsters are also dangerous. Hostile crowds wandering about in places that you don't know at night or when things are happening. Some of the most dangerous people that I think bullies, of course, people who are known to be are dangerous, and they can be extremely dangerous because they can, I don't know if you understand the saying, do your head in, but they can cause you serious psychological damage, which can lead to self-harming behaviours. So, you can be at risk of that, I think, from people as well. Some of the most dangerous people I feel that I have met are men who have murdered their partners, or men in the kind of groups which are set up to defend the rights of men who claim that they have been wrongly accused of gender-based violence. They are very, very militant about their innocence, even if they have long prison records to show that, in fact, they have been convicted of these kind of crimes. I think I would have to say, before I say anything more about this, though, that probably the most dangerous person in my case is myself. I've never had a sense of self-protection. And I don't think I'm unusual in that. I think journalists are strange people, and certainly journalists who are interested in talking to dangerous people are strange people. I have never really properly thought about safety. It's always been about the story. It's always been, who would be the best person to get to give insights into that kind of mindset? Who would be the best person to know about what that particular paramilitary faction is doing at the moment? Where would I find them? Okay, in the middle of that estate that nobody goes into except people who live there. Here I go, I know that I am perhaps an extreme case of that, but I think a lot of journalists are like that, and they are impatient with safety advice. They're impatient with being told that maybe it wouldn't be safe to go there after a riot or at night when people will have been drinking or taking drugs or whatever. I know that when I say I've often gone to meet people in lonely places, it's obviously not a wise thing to do, but sometimes it is actually the place where you're going to meet those people. I have gone to meet a number of men who are accused of killing their partners or of murdering a woman in lonely places at their homes, despite having been warned that they're psychopaths. And I don't say that in a sense of bragging about it. I'm just saying that's the kind of thing that people like me have done and do and probably will continue to do no matter what sort of advice you get. So that's where I think editors really need to take some responsibility and start telling people, well, you just can't do that. You can't take that risk. I have to say I have never, ever received any safety advice from any editor. The first safety advice that I ever got was at a dart function, which I was invited to some years ago in County Kerry by the late and much missed Seamus Kelter, who's another Northern Ireland journalist. And I was just asking Bruce about that I was advised at that by Professor Frank Ockberg that I appeared to have a problem with male authority figures, which, as Bruce also pointed out, was probably not his most profound insight of his career. But I mean, having an attitude of wanting to challenge people is actually very dangerous in a journalist. You should not be challenging to these people. You should try to be neutral. You should try to be there to ask them questions in such a way that they do not feel that you are challenging them. But I have found myself in situations almost getting into arguments with people, and that is, I recognize, risky behavior, because if they start to feel that you're against them, you are provoking their hostility. It is also dangerous, however, to be overly friendly. I obtained an interview once with somebody very dangerous on the basis of pointing out to him that I came from somewhere very close to where he lived and was from himself, completely neglecting to remember that my mother still lives there and that it was really a very stupid thing to do. And he was charmed by the fact that I was from just down the road from him. But when he later turned quite nasty, I felt really, really bad about the fact that I had, potentially exposed a member of my family to hassle at the least. And I think a lot of journalists have written about being quite reckless about themselves, but feeling quite ashamed when they've put other people at risk. I can think of another situation in which I got into an argument with a loyalist paramilitary who was trying to stop some journalists from going to an event that he had invited them to. And I started to argue with him, and he started to get very angry. And I suddenly sort of realized that I was putting other people at risk by entering into this, and I did back down on that occasion, and so did he, in fact, and we were allowed to go to the event after all. But sometimes it's as well to try, if you don't have a good sense of self-protection, I think it's a good idea to think about what would you advise somebody else to do in this circumstance, somebody that you cared a bit more about yourself than you cared about a bit more than you apparently care about yourself. So I think that's probably all I want to say for now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's actually go straight to Drew, and we'll do questions, I think afterwards, because one of the questions that comes from that, from what Susan has just said, is how can editors create systems and structures that protect journalists? And you've worked with, you've had to systematize things because you've worked with so many journalists who are potentially exposed to risk in a way, far exceeding a normal editor's experience of these things.
So our rule is very simple. It's the editor is at fault. The editor is responsible for the health and safety of all their journalists, which puts a tremendous amount of responsibility on them to make sure that everybody's doing things the right way. And unfortunately, we lost a partner recently. Jan Kuciak was working with us when he was killed, and it made us do a really close relook at everything that we do and how we do it, because the thing about death is it's not predictable. None of these things are easily predictable. And so you have to work very, very hard to provide safety. And, Susan's right, the journalists don't have a sense of self-protection. And my experience has been that it's not that we are courageous, we're just unable to see the ramifications of our actions a lot of the times. And actually, I have one reporter who is fearless, and then we ran into a particular organized crime figure who likes to cut women on the face with a knife, and she completely melted down because the thought of getting cut in the face was something she had never seen as being an outcome of her reporting, and suddenly it all came in on her what she was really doing. And, there needs to be that moment for all journalists when they realize this is dangerous. We're like firefighters. Firefighters have a really difficult job, and it's a very unsafe job. We are like firefighters, and firefighters have protective gear and equipment and regular training over and over on the fake burning building, and we as journalists don't do that, and it's a real problem. So, and then a lot of journalists, get their training from watching films, on organized crime. And that's the worst possible thing because reality is very much different from Hollywood, and you shouldn't use that. The first step in anything is a risk assessment. You do not a fireman wouldn't go into a burning factory without knowing what chemicals are in that factory. The same way, you should never go interview somebody who is an organized crime or in a Salafist group or a skinhead group without doing a risk assessment of that person and what they do and their organization. And so I have what I call the 4 questions of life. I used to call them the 4 questions of death, but I'm trying to be, and you have to answer these questions before you go in. And the first question is, do they kill? The truth is some organized crime people kill and some people don't. And you got to know the difference between those that do. When do they kill? How do they kill and why do they kill? And so these are really critical. You have to know their modus operandi. The Salafist groups in Tunisia always rent an apartment across the street from you for 2 or 3 months, watch you, and then you will be killed by a two-person motorcycle gang, two-person motorcycle crew, with the person on the back with the gun. I mean, it's like clockwork. And when you know that, then you can do some things to protect yourself. So you have to do a risk assessment, and that has to be a serious risk assessment. And then you have to figure out in each individual person or group what the landmines are. There's always landmines in a particular group. It might be another group that they're fighting with. It might be, the fact that, somebody in the organization has a reputation of being gay. There's weird stuff that's individual to a group. One area that's always sensitive is family, okay? When you're dealing with organized crime people, their big concern is their family. And so, the question, how is your daughter, suddenly becomes a threat. When an organized crime person asks you, how is your daughter, that is an implicit threat. That's the way they're going to interpret it too. So we whatever we do, we stay away from family. We stay away from embarrassing details. We stay away from personal information. I had a reporter I was working with in Tunisia, and she was doing a story about a Saudi imam who was running a Salafist group. And they had dropped bodies. They had dropped a lot of bodies. So they were a very dangerous group. And she said, he's married to this Berber woman, and she's from a very low class, a caste. And that's really interesting. And I said, drop it. She said, no. This tells a lot about him. I'm going to put it in the story. And I said, please drop it. Do not mention it in the story. She, of course, didn't listen to me, put it in the story, and in fact, the problem wasn't that she was from a low caste or anything, it's that his wife in Saudi Arabia didn't know that he was married in Tunisia, which caused a really severe problem. And he took that as a threat, and she's still undercover 3 years later, So these are the types of stupid things that you can do. Thinking of it from a journalist standpoint, you can't think from a journalist standpoint. You need to think from their standpoint. So the numbers are pretty clear. 70% of all reporters are killed because of their reporting, and 70% of these are never warned. So the highest probability is that somebody will just come up to you and shoot you if you've done the story wrong and if you've done the interview wrong. You're not really at danger at the interview. You're in danger. In the Balkans, they kill you between 6 and 18 months after the story, okay? That's what you're worried about, is 6 to 18 months later. So the key here is to leave the interview and to leave the story without those people thinking about killing you. That's the goal, okay? And that's a hard goal if you haven't done your research and if you don't understand who these people are. So on the interview itself, the types of personalities, usually there's 3 main personalities I've seen in people I've interviewed. The first is the alpha male aggressive bully, okay? You'll see this a lot. They're just extremely manipulative. They're aggressive towards you. They're verbally aggressive. You also get the kind of the cool, smooth businessman, and then sometimes you have the kind of the weak, needy, asking for help kind of organized crime figure. But all of them can turn into the mean, aggressive bully very, very quickly. They all have it in them, otherwise they wouldn't be in organized crime. And understand why they're there. They're coming to meet you because they, want to assess who you are. There's a lot of media in my part of the world that are paid for by organized crime. So their first thought is if you're doing a story on them, you're somebody who has been paid by another organized crime figure to do a bad story on you, okay? So that's what they're thinking. They're trying to figure out what you know, okay? And they're looking for weak points, something that they can, pressure points where they can, put pressure on you. And they're not there to give you information. That's the last thing they're really interested in, is actually giving you information. So it's an extremely difficult interview, and my kind of rule when I go into these, I know that they're lying to me when their mouth is open. If you've ever interviewed an organized crime figure, they're lying to you almost from the beginning of the interview to the end of the interview. And part of this is manipulation, and part of this is misinformation, and part of this is just plain fucking with you. okay, which they like to do, okay? So what you're actually trying to do is catch some information, but then use that later on in your reporting. And you ask questions like, well, how do you know that? And do you have proof for that? And kind of push them. The other thing that you need to do is you need to explain who you are and what you're doing. They may not have been interviewed by journalists before. And so you need to be you need to cast the image of being extremely professional. And the best thing to do it is just explain how the whole process works. And say, I'm going to be interviewing you now. I'm going to call you back if there's problems. When I publish a story, I'll call you afterwards, which you always want to do, to make sure that there's no problems. If there's an error, I will correct it right away. The other thing you need to make perfectly clear is you do not control things. You do not want to promise anything in an interview, because you know what? I'm the editor. I may not hold that promise. And if you've promised something, I might have to get you out of the country for a couple of years, and I don't really like to do that. That's really expensive, okay? So you will really piss me off if you promise something to somebody that you cannot deliver. And that's your backup. You can always say, hey, I don't control this, my editor does. You can talk to my editor. I can't promise I'll write that in the story, but I'll bring it up with the editor, and you're welcome to talk to the editor. Always give yourself an out so that you don't have to be stuck at that moment, which is what they'll try to do, pressing you for some kind of agreement or some kind of way that the story would be cast, or to not run a story, which they'll often do. They might decide that you know too much, and they'll want to shut you down and say, look, I really don't want a story run, so you better not run a story, okay? And then you have to deal with that, okay? In the Balkans, it's very much, you can't be afraid when you're in these interviews. You have to be at your game. And so we do a lot of role-playing exercises for people who haven't interviewed organized crime people, conducted by the part of the organized crime player is played by a journalist who've done a lot of these. And we have some very good journalists who are very good at pressing your buttons and threatening you in very kind of specific and non-specific ways. So you really need to hold your own, and you can't be bullied. You can't fight back. You can't scream at them. You can't, necessarily do all those kind of things. You need to be professional at all times. But you need to hold your own, and you need to be strong. And there's a certain amount of respect that's afforded to you by certain organized crime gangs if you can be, a strong journalist and not get, frazzled by the kind of things they're doing to you. They're testing you at every single time to find out what kind of person you are. And you need to be able to pass that test. Now, occasionally you'll get threatened. You'll get threatened implicitly, or you'll get threatened indirectly. One of my rules is I do not sit there and get threatened. I will not be threatened. And so I'll stop the interview right there, and I'll say, look, I came to you as a professional. I'm seeking your input into the story. I want to represent what you have to say, but I'm not going to sit here and be threatened. I'm going to leave right now. And then they'll say, oh, no, don't worry about it. But you're sending a clear note that you will not be manipulated and you will not be bullied. And that's really important in these types of situations. Occasionally an interview will go south very quickly. And my rules to all my reporters are save yourself. Whatever you need to say to get out of that room alive, save yourself and get out of there right away. Blame me. Okay, my job is to be blamed. You can just say, look, it's the editor. He made me come here and do this. I don't want to have anything to do with the story. You're right. Leave me out of this. If that's what's going to take, if that's what it's going to take to say to save yourself, do that. Make sure your editor is supportive and that you've got a good editor and that, most editors, you're right. The typical safety advice of most editors around the world is, be careful out there, That's literally what you get from most editors. It's really a serious dereliction of editorial responsibility, but it happens all the time. So I allow my reporters to always blame me, and I'll bet they just need to tell me that I've been blamed, and then I need to deal with it, and we have ways of dealing with it. Okay. When you're dealing with, sometimes you'll be dealing with politicians. Politicians are generally weak organized crime figures, so. They'll go very quickly to a threat, but we don't really take most politicians' threats seriously. Organized crime doesn't threaten you. They just kill you. You're never going to get that threat and call, don't do the story, I'll kill you. That does not come from organized crime. What they will do is they will surveil you for 3 to 6 weeks. They'll figure out where you're weakest, which is usually at home in the office, and then somebody will come up behind you and shoot you in the head. That's how it works. So that's what we need to be prepared for. That's what why our security protocols are built around surveillance and counter-surveillance, because there's a period of time when they have to figure out that you're a danger. Now remember, they mostly do this not because this is not personal to them. This is business. It's not personal. That is true in the movies. It often is very impersonal. When they decide to kill a reporter, they're doing a risk-benefit analysis that says, can I get away with this? Is this going to cause me any problems? Will this stop the story? Will this intimidate other reporters to stop doing things? So they're making this cost-benefit analysis, and we're working it the other way, saying, hey, if you do something to us, we're going to make your life miserable. We're going to put 20 reporters on this. You're going to have serious problems. We're going to blame you. And every once in a while, I've had to make that call where I call somebody and I say, look, we have some feelings that you're causing danger to our reporter, and I just want you to know, if my reporter, anything happens to them, if they have a car accident or a heart attack, I am blaming you. I'm blaming you aggressively, and I'm going to put your name all over the press as the person who we suspect killed our reporter. Now you've just changed that risk-benefit analysis to them significantly, and it affords you some kind of security, but you don't want to do that, if it's not something that you have to do. Now, occasionally, and I think Gavin will talk a little bit about this, you will run into what are called psychopaths. You have to understand what a psychopath is, and you should get some training on those things. But these are people that don't have a whole lot of compunction for killing you. And these can be extremely dangerous people. They're often very smart, so it's not like they're just going to go out and shoot you in the head just because you've given them a weird look. But they are likely to be more likely to kill you. And then you have skinheads, you have religious groups, you have all sorts of different groups that the logic in this gets kind of overridden by other issues. And that makes them harder. The general rule of thumb is the higher in the organization you interview somebody, the safer you are. I mean, there's nothing worse. The actual worst interview I want to do is the 14-year-old drug-addled, Kalashnikov-wielding, teenager, with the death stare. I mean, that's the worst thing. The low-end drug dealer, that's the bad thing. The manipulative high-end boss, they're smarter, and you really want to interview the smartest possible person you can do, because they will understand that it's not in their interest to kill you. And that's why it's so important to explain who you are and how you do and where you fit into all this, So it's, it's a difficult thing. The other thing this is not training here in this room. This is the coming attractions. If you're seriously interested in doing this, you need to find some place to get very good, serious training on working in unsafe conditions. And you need to have backup plans all the time. We have fairly sophisticated procedures where nobody goes to an interview alone. We take a lot of care in setting up where interviews are done. I will not allow a reporter to go in and just interview somebody, in their house in some rural village that I don't have control of. And all these things need to be considered when doing it. So it's not something you want to just go out and try. You want to get serious training before you do this. And there's some people in this room that can help you with that. So
great, thanks. Thanks, Drew. That's great. Look, one quick thing I'd like to pick up on, though, because if you go to like a classical investigative journalism seminar and people teach you interviewing skills when it comes to interviewing, like, say, a corrupt guy from a chemical factory who may have, released dioxins into the water, what you're often advised to do is do a kind of onion-type process where you amass lots of information so that when you're in the interview, you can then surprise this guy with stuff that they don't know that you know. How safe is that if you're working with really dangerous people?
Yeah, as a general rule, no surprises. Surprise is a bad thing. I mean, you can still have some reveals in the interview if you just do it very carefully. And they should always know what's going to be in the story. Sometimes we do that with people. We don't let them know what we're really going to say. We play the weak, nice person who just asks only nice questions, but and then you kind of hint at something deeper, and that's a bad way to do this. They must know what you're going to say. No surprises really in the interview. You might want to let them know ahead of time that, you're going to have some difficult questions about some things. So it's just you have to, you're interviewing somebody to stay alive, okay? That's really the rule here. You're staying alive. This is all designed to get information, but it's mostly designed to stay alive. You can't give them reasons to kill you after you publish a story. We are weak targets. We are easy targets. We're easily killed. You do not have enough protection in your life to stop an organized crime gang from killing you. You simply do not. They will get you. And so you have to end up the story with them not wanting to kill you.
Okay, thanks. I'm sure you picked up on this. I mean, I'm just hearing the word, you mustn't let them kill you. I can feel a kind of rising sense of vulnerability in me, thinking about that, and maybe a slight kind of shutting off and sort of tensing up to try and deal with that. But I think the word vulnerability is interesting and a really useful word, because these people, or people who have dangerous backgrounds, make us feel vulnerable, but then often the origin of that itself is their sense of vulnerability. So I think that's the kind of underlying theme, really, with the idea about no surprises, is actually they're vulnerable, they're potentially paranoid. If you suddenly reveal that you've been having conversations with other crime figures, then they may think you are working for the other crime figure, and so forth. So that's true in the world of kind of organized crime. But it's also true in the trajectory of how people come into criminal behavior of different types. It's often a story of past trauma, of vulnerability, of things happening. I mean, it's not the only reason, and these are complicated stories, and not everybody who has a neglectful or abusive childhood ends up taking to crime, but a lot of people who do have extremely adverse experiences. And one of the things that people who are affected by trauma lose is a sense of control, so a radical sense of disempowerment. And when we're journalists, we actually seek, if we're interviewing a vulnerable victim, we seek to give back a measure of control over the conversation. So it's kind of interesting that actually when you're interviewing vulnerable people who are victims of violence, you also should follow a no surprises policy as much as possible, because you don't want to put them in the place where they become triggered by intensely visceral experiences that well up suddenly. In some cases, if you talk in detail about the events of a murder or a wounding or an attack of some type, the person can sort of transpose themselves back into that moment and even feel that it's happening again. Now, while that's true of victims, that can also be true of perpetrators as well. So there's a whole thing here about vulnerability. And in terms of the kind of preparation that we'd recommend is reading as much as you can about the origins of violence, reading kind of simple guides to how people become criminals and so forth. And the thing about life history and the research you can do into that is very important. And also, if you're going into a prison, for example, and talking to prisoners, you're going to want to know their criminal history in detail, and not just as information for the story, but also as clues to the interaction and how you have those conversations. For example, if you find out that a particular person is extremely dismissive and extremely taciturn, and then you're interviewing them and they're incredibly charming, incredibly gregarious, then this interview has a special loading. Something is going on. So as Drew said, a lot of encounters, particularly in criminal justice contexts, are going to be highly transactional. They're going to be motivated to get particular things out of you, and that's going to be the dominant thing. And that's fine, because if this is business, then it's business. They want something, we want something. If we can be clear about that, that's a kind of good basis for the conversation to happen. You might also, though, be finding yourself interviewing people who will have, transactional needs, who will want to get things out of the interview. But what perhaps is at foreground is their attempt to deal with the wounding experiences that they've had. I mean, one classic example of that might be if you're interviewing child soldiers or people who were torturers or people who were forced into genocidal situations. A lot of those aren't willing. A child soldier is normally forced to kill. There's an act of perpetration that sits in them and on them. They have to work through that. That can affect how they respond to you as well. And in this sense, a lot of the people who are potentially dangerous may be intensely vulnerable. So one of the questions is how do we curate conversations with people in a way that creates a kind of firm structure so people know where you're coming from, they know they're not going to be surprises. And in most conversations, what we are taught to do is to get on side with somebody, so build rapport. Perhaps offer a little bit of information about ourselves, as Susan was saying earlier, so that we can kind of build a kind of common base for interview. This is potentially really dangerous to do with anybody who's criminal. You may be lucky, the person that you may be interviewing may be your kind of accidental criminal, as it were, but it's more likely to be somebody who's had a long history of abuse, a long history of disempowerment, and is therefore very, very good at finding ways of turning the tables and taking control in the situation. And some of this stuff can be unbelievably subtle and very hard to spot. So if somebody's been incarcerated in a prison, there ain't a lot to do in prison except watch human behavior. Okay? So they become very good at looking for points of weakness. And because in a prison you have a hierarchy in which being bossed around once or twice can mean that literally you become somebody's bitch. People are also very invested in finding control and finding little things that can potentially give them control over the interviewer. So I'm not a psychologist, by the way. I should have said this. I come from a journalist and film background. But because I work for the Dart Centre, I know an awful lot of psychologists and psychiatrists. So we have a kind of broad network. And recently I was talking to a forensic psychiatrist called Bernie Chin, who does assessments in prisons. And I asked him, what would be your kind of sort of key point of advice about knowing when you're sort of sliding out of a good space in the interview? And he said that the thing to look out for is when you start noticing that you're speaking about yourself more than they're answering your questions. So it means that the tables have subtly turned. One thing to be aware of is that people who are true psychopaths are, in a very odd way, extremely good at empathy. Okay, because we think about them as people who kill without conscience, so therefore they're people who lack empathy. But actually the kind of modern research into this suggests that empathy has sort of three components. One is an intellectual component, that's understanding people's state of mind. Another one is the emotional response, and that's like feeling stuff. And the third one, which is kind of emotional motor response. So that means that somebody has an emotion, and then you pick up elements of that emotion, so you're aware the emotion is in the place. Now, without going into the whole kind of brain science, the people who are psychopaths often have a damaged capacity to genuinely feel something, but they're getting all of the triggers. So in other words, they're observing what's going on, they understand what emotion is, because they've been watching these weird people who get very upset about things and thinking, that's interesting, why is this person upset? And so they have an array of information, and also they're unencumbered by that own sense of, oh my God, this is awful. They're unencumbered by their kind of own emotional processes. So you have to be clear about that.
I think that, when you talk about what these people want from interviews, it is radically different from what you want from the interview. Yeah. In my experience, most of these kind of people that we're talking about are doing the interview because they wish to threaten somebody via you as a journalist. They want to threaten that they will do something if they don't get their way or if they don't get listened to or whatever. And you're there to probably work out, are they realistically making this threat? What is their capacity to follow through on this threat? And, is this just bullying kind of heavy talk? But I want to just say that I think that we haven't properly talked about the gendered aspect of this. It is quite a different thing to be a woman going into some of these situations than it is to be a man. And Drew mentioned that in relation to his colleague who was encountering somebody who liked to mark women's faces. I think a lot of women go into interviews with dangerous men afraid of sexual violence as well, and that is something that should be included in any kind of training. Sometimes these men will deliberately start talking to you about sexual things or about their relationships with women in a way which is quite intimidating, and it's quite hard to know how to respond to it. And sometimes, it just occurred to me listening to you talking that a conversation that I hadn't understood with a certain man was actually a threat. But you see, this is my problem. I process things quite slowly. That interview happened several years ago, but luckily it appears that he hasn't followed through on it. But, there is that thing that you do sometimes feel particularly vulnerable because you're a woman. But there's also another aspect to it, which is that women within organised crime type groups, or women who are part of the circle of dangerous violent men, don't like other women who don't admire those men. And I've certainly found myself in situations where a friend of mine said to me, it's not those guys you should be afraid of, it's the women. Somebody's going to have a go at you with a pair of scissors someday, and that's the other thing that you learn from domestic violence. Everything can be a weapon. It's not just guns that are weapons. Irons can be weapons. Scissors can be weapons. Cups of boiling tea can be weapons. Just to corroborate the other thing that you said about the vulnerability of threatening people, I think that it's certainly a proven thing from domestic violence is that men who are violent against women are at their most dangerous at the point that they think that the woman is onto them or is about to leave. So if they think you see through them, then they will feel particularly vulnerable, and that's when they're at most risk of being violent. And I think that's probably why, as I said, the circumstances in which I felt most at risk have been with those type of men, because they hate feminists.
That's actually a really good segue into, so we talked about psychopaths a bit. This isn't supposed to be a kind of I Spy guide to psychopathology. But one thing that's very big in domestic violence is narcissism. And so you may be interviewing an abuser of some type or a crime figure who's way down the narcissism spectrum. And unfortunately, thanks to recent political events, we've all got a much better idea of what narcissism looks like due to an election a couple of years ago. So we have a template. Actually, in some ways, this is about the only positive thing about it, is that we know what narcissists look like. But you have to be very careful with somebody who is violent and narcissistic, is that you don't unravel their identity. So how do you challenge them? How do you have a conversation with them that doesn't imply that their little image that they have of themselves, which is the thing that keeps them alive psychologically, is invalid? So we have to think carefully about how you challenge people in that situation. And one tip is to make it a kind of neutral conversation. So I'm not here to judge you. I just want to understand what happened. Now, this other person, this is their account of the event. They say what happened, but I want to hear your view because nobody's listened to your perspective and so forth. I'm going to take questions in a second, yeah. So nobody's heard your perspective. So what would your account of that be? So be careful that you don't challenge people in that way. Or you're subtle about it, and then you might actually empathize. Empathizing can be really good. You might say something like, wow, it sounds like nobody really understood that. That must have been hard for you. And you might get people talking in more detail about where they're coming from. So careful about challenging. The other thing is to think about, if people have had intensely visceral experiences, is that you need to be aware that when people have gone through trauma, they might not remember what happened very clearly. Because in a traumatic moment, the brain attends to particular things. It might focus on one moment of the scene. It might jumble up accounts. And so as Drew said, yes, sure, organised crime figures are pretty devoted to lying. Sometimes when people give you the wrong information, it ain't because they're lying, it's just because they don't really remember what happened. So all those hot shards of experience get jumbled up, the time frame gets confused. Classically, in lots of police witness statements, people might misidentify who the assailant is. If there's a crowd of people, they think it was somebody else. Their brain hasn't kind of properly recorded information, so you need to be aware of that. Also, emotional dysregulation. If somebody goes silent or starts laughing in a strange way, it might be because they're kind of some kind of crazy person, but it might also be a kind of product of the trauma. So in this city, Amanda Knox was tried for the murder of Meredith Kircher, and you'll have heard this story. It was very well known. One of the things in the police case against her was that while she was in detention, she was seen to do kind of cartwheels in a corridor. And so this was taken as prima facie evidence that she was in somehow criminal. But the point behind that is people do often very strange things to kind of manage their traumatic reactions and when they're in peculiar situations. They seek ways of getting control over the situation that might feel odd. Be careful with triggers. So please think very, very carefully about whether you'd want to take somebody back to the scene of perpetration or the scene of where things happen, because they may find themselves transported back into that moment of time momentarily, and that can be both dangerous for you potentially, but also very dangerous for them as well. So those are thinking. Anyway, yeah, true. Yeah.
A couple of things that what you
Please.
both have said, which I think are really important. First of all, to pick up on a point Susan makes, a lot of young journalists who are women will tend to use the social tools that they have at their disposal, sometimes in interviews. And one of those social tools women have is flirting. And this is, again, something extremely dangerous in these types of dangerous interviews. You do not want to flirt. You do not want to be attractive. You don't want to give them anything that would give them any cause to look at you, from a gender standpoint. And so this is kind of a critical issue. Secondly, as Gavin said, some of these people have been victimized in their youth, but there's also a culture, there's a socialization that goes on, especially in Italy, where you have, people's whole families for the last 6, 8, 10 generations have been organized crime. And so, a lot of people are socialized into organized crime. And, I was talking to an Ndrangheta member that was in Germany, and he referred to people, and I stopped him because he had used a term. And I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, oh, victim. I refer to these people as victims. And it's organized crime sees people as the sheep that they shear. You are the victims. They are special. They are outside of the system. They are above the system. The rules don't apply to them. And you are all the victims, which they take advantage whenever they want. I was surprised. I was looking into an organized crime figure. He was a multi-billionaire, and yet he was driving a stolen car. And at first, I did not understand, why would you risk, driving a stolen car? And the truth of the matter was, they don't do anything in society. Society rules don't apply to them. So they will never follow the rules just out of their socialization. And so this is something to keep in mind. They have a whole different culture that they're seeing the world from, and if you don't understand it, you're in trouble. Now, if you're getting into this and you want to start really, if this really interests you, Gavin mentioned prisons, and prisons are the best place to interview organized crime figures because, of course, they're no threat to you, although they can still get you outside. I mean, people in prison can always kill you outside of prison, so you still got to take care. But prisons are the universities of organized crime. If you were not a criminal going into prison, you will be a criminal when you get out of prison. You will understand the criminal milieu. You'll be able to operate. You'll have contacts. You'll have everything you need to be a great criminal. And so these are also places where they got nothing to do. And so they'll talk to any asshole that comes through the door. And it's a wonderful time to really get to you can go in as a student. I'm doing a master's thesis. I want to understand how, certain things work. And it's a great place to work back and forth in a fairly safe environment and interviewing these types of people.
I just want to say one thing very quickly, because I know the audience must want to come in by
Yep.
now, but just very, very quickly, I think that Gavin said something about, perhaps potentially showing some empathy or understanding, or like saying to somebody, well, that must have been really hard or something. I think that's really dangerous when it comes to men who hate women, if you're a woman, because those guys think they are the victims. No matter how much harm they've done to women, they think they are the victims of women. And if you start kind of pretending to have empathy towards that point of view, you're undoubtedly then going to write a piece which will disabuse them of the notion that you had any sympathy whatsoever for them. And that is potentially dangerous.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on that. I think I'd say two things to that. First of all, very much case-by-case situation. So I'm talking about a whole range of different people who've been impacted by violence. And so not necessarily...
Yeah, but just in that particular case, that is a dangerous thing to do, I think.
Yeah. But also I think another thing which is, this is a dangerous line of things to open up, is what's very useful when you're dealing with people with these kind of complex backgrounds is another word which sounds a bit like empathy and it's a bit different, and that's compassion. Okay? And so that raises all kinds of things. If you say, how can you be compassionate towards somebody who's done kind of heinous acts or has a capacity to do awful violence? That's actually a misunderstanding of what compassion is. So compassion is the ability to understand where somebody comes from and to understand the suffering and the root that's brought them there. It in no way, absolutely in no way, excuses what the person's done. So there are all sorts of methodologies in psychology and psychotherapy that are used for like really awful, like forensic psychiatrists who are working with kind of people who've done hideous things. And what keeps the psychologists in a place where they can still do that work and they can look after themselves is this idea of compassion, is of trying to, understand how this happened. So curiosity, false empathy, being a false friend in any way, I agree is a really dangerous thing. So you also have to be very careful that you don't, as Drew was saying, generally, that you're careful that you're not making promises about the copy. This copy will exonerate you. Everybody will, will understand how badly you've been treated. These kinds of promises are also very, very dangerous. But thanks, I think it's a really, really useful point.
The word we often use is non-judgmental.
Yeah.
So you're not ever, you have to deal with these incredibly, somebody who's murdered 8 people, and you can't judge them. You can't sit there and judge them. They will pick that up right away, and they'll distrust you. And if you don't have that trust, then it's more dangerous.
Yeah, and also don't forget, people who've been in the criminal justice system have been defined by the system. And there'll be an enormous body of notes that have been scribbled by policemen and by psychiatrists and by other professionals. And there'll be lots of news reports about the person that define them. And you imagine that at school, they probably didn't do very well at school. They may have been very bright, but they didn't fit in. The teachers defined them. Everybody defined them. So one thing that can be quite powerful, actually, is just listening. And if there are inaccuracies in the story that are genuine inaccuracies, listening to that and verifying it later and then correcting them. And that's not because we are a service for criminals, etc. But it's also a way of explaining to the person that you're interviewing and establishing what the business of journalism is. It is about understanding what happened and being accurate and insightful about things.
I fear we're treating them too much like wounded birds, though. These are people who will cut you up with a knife and leave you on the doorstep.
Yeah.
And so you can't ever forget that these are brutal human beings who don't care that you exist, and you have to protect yourself first.
Great. I'd like to say that we can do both. So be very, very aware these are brutal people who can kill you, but also, so really no excuses. I'm not exonerating everybody, but just a question of, and also we're talking about different kinds of stories as well. So we could be talking about somebody who hasn't got a long crime history actually, and who's just found themselves in a place where they lost control. So there are varied stories. Anyway, enough of that philosophical spin. Questions, please. So the lady in the pink jumper, and then Cassandra, please.
Hi there, I'm Lexi, and I am a student here. And my question is, whether a woman is thin or fat, or whether a woman is flirting or not flirting, or whether a woman is of the LGBT community or not, or if she's of color, or if she's very pretty, or if she's not pretty, and she's a journalist. Will she ever be safe? I want to know your opinion. Will a female journalist ever be safe, whether she is young, middle-aged, or old, or if she has a lot of experience or not a lot of experience? Lindsay Addario, Lara Logan, she had a bodyguard with her, but she was still brutally sexually assaulted by multiple men. Even if she had covered up, do you think she would have been safe? And in general, do you think female journalists will ever be safe from sexual violence?
Well, I think that I didn't agree with the advice that women shouldn't be attractive, because if a woman's attractive, she can't stop herself being attractive. I do think that flirting is, by people of any gender, is dangerous when you're dealing with dangerous people. But I don't think it's, I think I have known editors who have sent young, good-looking young women out to interview dangerous people in the hope that they will be able to sort of flirt with them in such a way as to get a particular sort of story, and I think that's outrageous behaviour on the part of editors. But no, I think that women are at risk of gender-based violence in all working circumstances, so therefore that's a circumstance in which you have a right to expect protection and safety training and so on. But you can't let the risk of gender-based violence stop you going out into the world and doing things. I mean, that would be a really bad outcome for women. So I think we just have to understand gender-based violence and the risks that it poses.
And the majority of my investigative reporters are women. I've got more women investigative reporters. I have no problem sending them in any circumstance. I will send people in pairs often. And sometimes if I know a person has a history of gender problems, I'll send a man along with the woman, but women can do this. It's a matter of the personality of the journalist and whether they are able to really do a good job of deflecting all the other issues to what they want to do. If they can control the environment and the circumstance, then they're far more effective. So that has to do with just being a good journalist. And doing a good job as a journalist, which is what we're trying to train people to.
In terms of, I know there are some countries that have more sexual violence than others. Are there, have you come across news media companies that do not send a female to do certain reporting for her own safety? And how do you go about that? And Susan, have you experienced that yourself?
No, and I would be very annoyed if I wasn't sent on an assignment for any reason like that. I think that, as Drew said, I think the word that you used, deflect, is a good one. You need to have the strength of character in a circumstance to try to make the issue what you're talking about rather than anything about you. But no, I would be really annoyed if I thought that an editor wasn't sending me on an assignment because I was a woman.
Yeah, I would never take a woman off an assignment. I might add some additional support to discourage somebody, but that would be in extreme cases would I do that. I trust all my journalists to do the job, no matter what their gender.
Great. So I think Cassie's hand, and then there's two hands at the back, so we'll go that way. Okay, I think the microphone is... Yeah, we'll shuffle things around. We've got plenty of time.
So this is a question for Susan, but I'd like all your views. In your experience, are people who are, perpetrators of political violence safer than those who have got involved in violence for non-political reasons? I suppose what I'm asking here, obviously I'm from Belfast and have been socialised into not necessarily finding that threatening. But actually, I think that might be, I had a bit of a moment of clarity there when you were talking about perpetrators and vulnerability. And I'd really like your views on whether you think people who do political violence are less dangerous than other types of violence.
Just very, very brief response to that. I think macho men are dangerous, and macho men tend to be the type of men who get involved in paramilitary type violence or other armed violence and all the rest of the kinds of crime that we've been talking about. So it doesn't matter whether you meet them as a domestic perpetrator or as a person involved in some sort of other politically motivated activity.
Yeah, I'd add to that. I mean, particularly in civil conflict situations, in which a society is starting to kind of fall apart, then often the people who float to the top and find they've got a really good skill set are psychopaths. So if you look at, Balkan militia figures and some really twisted people, so I'm not sure that I couldn't make a generalization, because I think we're talking about a very varied mosaic of people, everything from relatively young people in street gangs to people who are organised crime figures to people who are domestic abusers with.
So I suppose the ordinary decent dissident thing.
Yeah.
That's a myth, basically. Yeah. Sorry, I mean what? The ordinary decent person who gets involved in political violence. Would you say that's a myth?
No, I wouldn't say it's entirely a myth, because there are people who take up causes and become very controlled and very dedicated to the cause, and actually in a weird way quite resilient. So some of the people who are most resilient under torture are violent political activists of different types, because it's kind of what they signed up for, so they're prepared for it in a way. But also, violence is corrupting. So once you get into violence, it's what we're talking about, the kind of child soldier situation, is that once somebody's killed, then they're effectively in a situation in which they're being forced into the place where their identity shifts. It's very hard to reintegrate with others. There's also a big sense of kind of cognitive dissonance. So if I've done something terrible to somebody, what am I going to do? I'm going to feel really, really guilty for a long period of time about the awful thing that I've done. Maybe I will. Or am I going to try and find ways of explaining that and saying, well, actually, you've got to be tough, you've got to be hard. People are sheep, is the idea that Drew was talking about. So violence is corrupting.
And the point is, a lot of political violence is, organized crime wants to murder you. They need you out. They need you dead. Often political violence is just an intimidation tactic. But when you've been beaten by a baseball bat, there's a thin line between, dead and alive. And you can get killed quite easily. So in the end, it may not matter. But political violence often doesn't start with the intent of killing people, but it often gets into that later on in kind of a war zone situation.
Right, so there's a question at the front and then a question at the back. Yeah, so I think you need the microphone, unfortunately, for posterity. Oh, can you give it to... So Cassie, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I just want to preface it by saying it's not to prove a point. I'm genuinely curious. Susan, you touched on women who are kind of tied to dangerous people that you're interviewing. But what about interviewing dangerous women? Is there any difference in your approach? Any tips in terms of your list of questions? What do you think we should be doing differently when we are interviewing dangerous women? And second question, hopefully really short, in terms of terminology in interviewing dangerous people. Sometimes they might refer to themselves as, I don't know, like a militia leader might say, I'm the army. Do you think it's okay for us to use the terminology that they use to describe themselves, or do you think that's also dangerous?
I'm not sure. I don't think that I've ever interviewed a woman who I have thought was dangerous to me in the sense that she was going to shoot me or anything like that, but I have interviewed women who were dangerous in the sense that they were extremely psychologically manipulative and bullying, and obviously wished harm to either me or others. But I don't have experience of ever interviewing women in a circumstance where I felt that they were different from men in that sense. I've interviewed women who are involved in paramilitary organisations, but I probably would have felt slightly less threat from them than men, because I felt none of the kind of macho male threat from them. But I'm not very good at answering your question. Drew might have more experience of that.
Well, we interviewed Setsa, who's she's a turbo folk singer in Serbia who's actually runs an organized crime gang now. Her husband was Arkan, the famous ethnic cleanser in Bosnia, and she's quite aggressive and she's quite dangerous. And we didn't really treat them any differently. It's the same when it comes down to violence is violence. And It's still a matter of, are you going to leave that interview with them saying I need to kill them or not? It's really the same. I don't know any difference. But that's the only case I know, and there's probably other dangerous people are out there, and we'd have to try to deal with it on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, yeah, so can I take the question at the back? Oh, okay, please, yeah. But can you make it short, so I haven't got very much time? Yeah.
My question is about the care of the journalist, because however strong and well-trained we are, there is an emotional and psychological toll, and it can be exhausting, particularly if you're working on things for a long time. I know, back in January, just dealing with the protests and interviewing a lot of people who are in dire poverty. After a while, nobody is entirely immune. So my question, actually, and it is to all of you, is how are we taking care of journalists and monitoring? I mean, I'm comparing our profession with a friend of mine who works in child protection. She has weekly monitoring with a psychologist. And certainly, I mean, she's had times where she's been working on cases and it's just battering and she's been told to take time off. What can we do to keep ourselves mentally healthy, and how and also the duty of care of editors just to monitor us or advise and direct journalists to support and even actually tell people to stop and take a break?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. It's really important. It's the other part of this. And we've already hinted at it, I think, in what Susan was saying about taking, you have to process things. And so people who are working in a kind of forensic clinical context, they get supervision. And what supervision really is, it's not a process in which you talk to a psychologist and they try and fix you. It's a place where you identify what happened and try to understand. And if people have been talking to very controlling people, it's definitely worth trying to get the conversation out of your head in a way and to try and understand where that person was sort of starting to kind of break into your defenses. And there's a more general thing really about pacing. I mean, if we're working on crime stories, we'll be doing potentially with a large amount of harrowing detail. And so it's very, very important that people pace themselves and find things that take them out of the story, whatever it is, a kind of way of getting away from stuff. And also having different strategies, I'd say, are important for dealing with anxiety. So when people are feeling the kind of threat response system, their defense system coming up, and may feel a bit on edge or go away from a conversation with somebody in which they find it easy to startle or start to think that perhaps one's being followed, is ways of kind of dampening down the distress system. And you can I mean, it does. It's like it's a legacy. Yeah. But I think that the thing I'd say about the vicarious kind of trauma aspect of things is that as a community, we don't tend to take it very seriously because we think, well, I'm not the victim. I'm maybe interviewing a criminal, but I'm not it's the people who were victimized by this person that have the real problems. And sure, that's true. They have the bigger impact. But if we're working on the crime beats or doing this work intensively, then those little fractions of experience start to add up. Drew, do you have something quick to add?
Well, the reality is that, I've got 160 reporters. None of them will say they need to talk to anybody. And most organizations that you will go to don't even consider this, let alone the safety of the journalist. So we're truly in a primitive time in journalism, and there needs to be this kind of counseling. And I've been reaching out at this very conference talking to people because I got reporters with addiction problems. I got reporters, who have, severe personality changes that they're undergoing, and I've got people who need this kind of help. And they won't ask for it, they won't seek it, and they will resist me trying to give it to them, because reporters are, tend to be, yeah.
Okay. So, Susan, one very brief comment. We've been told to stop.
Well, I think that's a good last line. Reporters are human.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
so it is typical that journalists you feel you've been covering really horrific stuff. You feel as if you want your soul rinsed, and the traditional route is to go and have a drink, you know.
Right.
And obviously that's not an advised way of dealing with things, but you know.
Great. So I'm really sorry we've run out of time for questions, but we'll be around outside for a few minutes. So please, yeah. Good. And thanks for being such an attentive audience. And I guess I have to say, stay safe. You know.